Fichte and Shankara by Leta Jane Lewis. Shankara set forth his Advaita Vedanta in India at about the turn of the 8th century, while Fichte expounded his science of knowledge, Wissenschaftslehre, in Germany approximately a millennium later. Since Fichte did not know Sanskrit, and since none of Shankara's works was available to him in translation, he could not have been directly influenced by his Indian predecessor, and no indirect influence of Shankara on Fichte has ever been established. But in spite of the fact that these two philosophers were far removed from each other in time, space, and cultural background, their theories are so striking in apparent similarity that they are almost certain to be juxtaposed, if only parenthetically, whenever Eastern and Western idealism is seriously discussed. Thus, Rudolf Otto, in a short essay on Fichte and the doctrine of Advaita, appendixed to his Mysticism East and West, states that these philosophers have achieved an almost complete identity in speculation. But he bases his impressions of Fichte almost exclusively on die Anweisung zum seligen Leben oder auch die Religionslehre, and does not make a complete comparison of Fichte's and Shankara's viewpoints. And such authorities in Eastern and Western philosophy as Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, Surendranath Dasgupta, P.T. Raju, and Helmuth von Glasenapp have been inspired by the at least superficial similarities in Fichte's and Shankara's ideas to make occasional comparative comments regarding them, without, however, choosing to deal with them in their entirety. Thus, a more complete study to determine the degree to which the Indian and the German philosophy in question are fundamentally alike, or only apparently so, seems still to constitute a challenging and rewarding project. Such a study will be made in this article. Fichte began his philosophical career as an enthusiastic disciple of Kant, whose critical philosophy he intended to elucidate but not to alter, and he firmly believed that he was adhering to Kant's ideas when, stressing the latter's transcendental method, he set out to interpret all seeming reality from a subjective standpoint. I accordingly explain publicly herewith that it is the inmost heart and soul of my philosophy that man has nothing whatsoever except experience, and he arrives at everything at which he arrives only by experience, by life itself. All his thinking issues forth from experience, and again has experience as its object. This is the tendency of my philosophy. It is also the tendency of the Kantian, which, at least on this point, will not free itself from me. While Kant held that the Ding an sich has an independent existence outside of conscious experience, Fichte endeavored to avoid the dualism of subject and noumenal object by maintaining that only that which is in and for consciousness can be assumed to exist, and that therefore there can be no unknowable Ding an sich. In the critical system, the thing, Ding, is that which is placed in the ego. In the dogmatic, it is that in which the ego itself is placed. Criticism is therefore immanent because it places everything in the ego. Dogmatism transcendent because it goes beyond the ego. Fichte contended that consciousness is the primary fact which neither needs to be proved nor can be proved, and which itself forms the ground of all proof, and he refused to include in his philosophy anything not ascertainable in or necessary to produce consciousness. However, instead of regarding consciousness itself as the ultimate unconditioned principle, he proposed to deduce such a principle from the fact of consciousness, and began by reasoning that the ego cannot be aware of anything. For example, that A equals A, without at first positing, setzen, its own existence. However, it is the absolute unconditioned ego prior to the appearance of consciousness, and not the already conscious empirical ego, which posits itself. And even after positing itself, the absolute ego remains unconscious, until, by positing the not-ego, it acquires something of which to be aware. In Fichte's opinion, consciousness is possible only through reflection, and reflection only through limitation. When its activity of positing itself strikes and reflects back upon the obstacle of its activity of positing the not-ego, consciousness arises, and the ego finds itself in an apparent world of objects, the result of the unconscious activity of produktive Einbildungskraft, power of productive imagination. Both ego and not-ego are now within consciousness, where, by Wechselbestimmung, alternate determination, they seem to limit and be limited by each other. The results of the activity of thought, they are themselves thought and have no substantial being. There is nothing permanent anywhere, neither outside of me nor in me, but only a constant change. I know of no being anywhere, not even of my own. There is no being. I myself know not at all, and am not. Pictures there are. They are all that exists, and they know about themselves in the manner of pictures. Pictures that float past without there being anything past which they float. They are connected by pictures with pictures. Pictures without anything represented in them, without meaning and purpose. I myself am one of these pictures. Yes, I am not even this, but only a confused picture of pictures. All reality is transformed into a strange dream, without a life that is dreamed about, and without a mind that dreams. The dialectic whereby Fichte reasoned from his thesis, the positing of the absolute ego by itself, to its antithesis, the positing of the not-ego, to the final synthesis, Wechselbestimmung, where, within consciousness, the ego and the not-ego appear to limit each other, is confined in its operation to the realm of finitude, and although it can produce higher and higher syntheses, it can never achieve an absolutely undifferentiated state. Thus, in the case of Wechselbestimmung, there is no object outside consciousness, but within consciousness the apparent dualism of subject and object persists. Shankara agreed with Fichte in regarding consciousness as the fundamental fact which neither needs to be proved nor can be proved, and which furnishes the ground of all proof. But, while Fichte believed that since the absolute by no means directly enters our consciousness, it is necessary to acquire proof of it through deduction, Shankara was certain that the absolute can be known directly, and therefore found no such reasoning needful. Shankara recognized two types of perception, that of the senses, whose findings are finite and therefore not absolutely real, and that of turiya, transcendental consciousness, to whose testimony alone he ascribed absolute reality, and in accordance with which he asserted that the infallible statements of the scriptures can be interpreted and verified. He held that in turiya, the consciousness proper to the Atman, the self, is identical with that proper to Brahman, the absolute, and that, when Brahman is experienced in this ultimate state of awareness, the jiva, the individual soul, as such disappears, and only the Atman, which is none other than Brahman, remains. There is then no distinction between subject and object, since both are identical with Brahman, and therefore with each other. Thus, Shankara taught that there is complete non-dualism in the highest state of consciousness, while Fichte admitted no awareness superior to the empirical, in which subject and object will always be differentiated. Although Shankara accepted the scriptures and perception as the most reliable epistemological sources, he did not reject the use of inference to support their evidence. In accord with Fichte, he regarded rational proof of the absolute to be desirable, but his method of arriving at this proof differed from Fichte's. Shankara explained, moreover, the existence of Brahman is known on the ground of its being the self of everyone. For every one is conscious of the existence of his self, and never thinks, I am not. And the self, of whose existence all are conscious, is Brahman. Shankara also inferred the permanence of the self from the permanence of consciousness, which inheres in the self. Hence, in the same way as we admit the existence of that perceptive consciousness, which has the material elements and their products for its objects, we also admit the separateness of that consciousness from the elements. And as consciousness constitutes the character of our self, the self must be distinct from the body. That consciousness is permanent, follows from the uniformity of its character, and we therefore may conclude that the conscious self is permanent also, as also follows from the fact that the self, although connected with a different state, recognizes itself as the conscious agent, a recognition expressed in judgments such as, I saw this, and from the fact of remembrance and so on being possible. To avoid identifying the unconditioned Brahman with material objects, Shankara indicated that the elements and the body are different from the self, which is equated with Brahman. Although he insisted that the universe be regarded as separate from Brahman, this expression of negation does not present his total view of nature, for he considered the absolute to be the ground of the seemingly material universe, as well as of all consciousness. There has been much argument concerning Shankara's exact view as to the status and nature of the phenomenal world. In general, the school of Advaita Vedanta which he founded holds that the objects of sense perception are an appearance, vivarta, of the one Brahman. The world is the result of the sort of superimposition, adhyasa, which occurs when a rope is mistaken for a snake. There is, in such a case, no transformation, parinama, into the snake or into the world. It is Brahman, the knowable, that appears as the bodies, moving and unmoving, just as a rope appears as a snake. The universe, like the snake, may be said neither to exist nor not to exist. As the world appearance, Maya, is imposed upon the one reality, the immutable Brahman, it exists because Brahman exists. But since the universe is subject to change, it does not really, i.e. absolutely, exist as Brahman exists. According to the Advaita, the error of mistaking Brahman for the universe originates in some unknown way outside of the mind, on which it is imposed. Thus, Brahman may be termed the material and efficient cause of the universe, if care is taken that no misunderstanding arises through misinterpretation of these terms. Brahman is the material cause of the universe in that the latter is none other than Brahman. But Brahman is not material. Again, since Brahman alone exists, it must be the efficient cause of the world appearance. But Brahman, unlike Fichte's absolute ego, must not be conceived of as acting. The magnet is itself devoid of motion, and yet it moves iron. So the Lord also, who is all-present, the self of all-moving and all-powerful, may, although himself unmoving, move the universe. From the foregoing, it has become apparent that neither Fichte nor Shankara believed that an extra-mundane deity created the universe from nothing. Fichte made an issue of refuting the theory of creation, which he found in the usual Christian theology. He insisted that it must be termed dogmatic, and rejected because it implies a creator apart from the world. The supposing of a creation is the first criterion of falsehood. Paradoxically, the two absolutes, the absolute ego and Brahman, which according to the philosophies of Fichte and Shankara are responsible for the appearance of the material universe and individual consciousness, are not identical. Sages of the school of Shankara, attempting to put into words the ineffable experience of Brahman, describe it as absolute existence, absolute consciousness, and absolute bliss, Satchidananda. Brahman is eternal, all-knowing, absolutely self-sufficient, ever pure, intelligent and free, pure knowledge, absolute bliss. But Fichte, who did not consider absolute consciousness, consciousness without an object, to be possible, attempted to explain empirical consciousness as the result of a sense of limitation brought about by the activity of the unconscious absolute ego. Since he did not believe that anything unnecessary for empirical consciousness could be proved, he did not ascribe to the absolute ego of the Wissenschaftslehre of 1794 any attributes beyond mental activity, which, in his opinion, is alone sufficient to account for consciousness. However, in later writings, such as Die Anweisung zum seligen Leben, the Wissenschaftslehre of 1801, and Die Bestimmung des Menschen, Fichte equated the absolute not only with God, but with life, light, infinite will, and holy will, and in defending himself against the charge of atheism, he appeared to accept the possibility of absolute consciousness and intelligence. On this decisive denial of the comprehensibility of God is based what I have brought forward in my article about the impossibility of attributing personality and consciousness to God. One should not overlook the reason for which I denied this possibility. I spoke of our own comprehensible consciousness, pointing out that the concept naturally implies limitations, and that, accordingly, this concept of consciousness cannot be valid for God. Only in consideration of this, only in consideration of the limitations and of the comprehensibility conditioned by them, have I denied the consciousness of God. From the point of view of matter, I take pains to express the incomprehensible as well as I can. From the point of view of matter, the divinity is pure consciousness. It is intelligence, pure intelligence, mental life, and activity. But to grasp this intelligent being in a concept and to describe how it knows itself and others is simply impossible. This passage must refer to one of the two absolutes with which, on various occasions, Fichte identified God. The first such absolute is the unconditioned ego, which acquires awareness by positing the not-ego. While it is still unconscious, its activity is unrestricted, but, as the outcome of its assuming the existence of a not-ego, it appears as the empirical ego experiencing limitation both of its activity and of its consciousness. and the second absolute, with which he sometimes equated God, is the identity of subject and object, which would result if Wechselbestimmung were to cease. But since, in Fichtean philosophy, Wechselbestimmung can never be transcended, this identity will always be a mere idea, never an actuality. Thus, the above-mentioned deity with absolute consciousness and absolute knowledge is, according to Fichte's reasoning, neither existent at the present time nor ever to become existent. Shankara, although regarding Brahman as non-dual, explained that mankind, in order to have a god whom it is possible to worship, distinguishes a lower Brahman with attributes, Saguna Brahman, from the higher unqualified Brahman, Nirguna Brahman. This lower Brahman is known as Ishvara, the Lord and Creator of the universe. While the only consciousness which Fichte's God possesses is human consciousness, Ishvara's consciousness is strictly his own, and not to be identified with that of any human being or human beings. It is therefore possible for the devotee, feeling himself separate from Ishvara, to enter into a personal relationship with him. But since Fichte's God has no awareness which is not human, the individual cannot conceivably enter into a personal relationship with him. Fichte's God, who at best is man's highest thought and endeavor, is divine only to the degree that these are divine, while Ishvara's independent divinity is always perfect, no matter what man's thoughts and deeds may be. Fichte and Shankara agreed in contending that philosophy is futile unless it is given practical application in daily life, unless it stimulates the effort to attain freedom in the absolute, and both insisted that ethical life is an important means to acquire the non-attachment to worldly things, which is necessary for progress toward this end. The entire contemporary world has no object of existence but the education of humanity in morality. Fichte felt that the individual might continue his evolution toward perfection even after death. These two orders, the purely spiritual and the sensuous, which latter may consist of an innumerable series of particular lives, have existed from the first moment of the development of an active reason in me and proceed close together. And Shankara believed that the jiva slowly approaches perfection in the course of many lives. However, while Shankara thought that the jiva would one day attain realization of the unity of the self and Brahman, Fichte conceived of no way to experience the absolute. His absolute is a goal which the individual inextricably involved in time and space can never reach, but may attempt to approach through an infinite progression which permits him to expand by appropriating to himself ad infinitum a little more of unending multiplicity without ever embracing its totality. He progresses by forcing farther and farther from himself the barrier which separates the ego from the not-ego, one human being from another. But I can never grasp infinity. I have, accordingly, a specific goal before my eyes, to which, without doubt, I can come closer, although upon reaching the latter, by the perfecting of my whole being in this way, and therefore of my insight, my goal may be removed just as much farther away from me, and I therefore, in this general point of view, never will come closer to the infinite. Shankara, to whom liberation meant release from the frustration by temporal vicissitudes of our efforts to be happy, taught that in moksha, freedom, the experience of the identity of the Atman with the immutable Brahman would automatically cause suffering to cease. And Fichte asserted that the frustration of the empirical ego in its drive, Trieb, into infinity could be alleviated temporarily by broadening the confines of the spirit through consideration for beings other than oneself and through the performance of duty. Although he thought non-dualism to be eternally remote, Fichte was certain that the constant effort to exceed the narrow limits of the individual self would make life abundantly rich and satisfying. In summary, it has become evident from the preceding analysis that striking and significant similarities exist between Fichte's so-called subjective idealism and Shankara's monistic idealism, and that these similarities are due partly to the fact that both philosophers held that one can be entirely certain only of consciousness, which is not subject to proof, but which is basic to all proof, and partly to the fact that they concurred in accepting a single absolute principle as the ground of all real or apparent existence and as the goal of life. However, because of differences in the interpretation of the exact nature of consciousness and of the absolute, Fichte's and Shankara's systems of thought embrace far-reaching divergences. Since Shankara ascribed absolute consciousness to Brahman and insisted that empirical consciousness is actually absolute consciousness unaware of its true nature, he claimed that it is possible to become absolutely conscious by abstracting the Atman from relativity. Fichte, on the contrary, did not make absolute consciousness an integral part of his philosophy, and instead of deriving empirical consciousness from it, he held the latter to be the result of the apparent limitation of the absolute ego. Shankara, while not rejecting the relative merit of the evidence of the senses, affirmed that a state of transcendental consciousness, turiya, has the only absolutely real epistemological validity. But Fichte, seeing no conscious connection between the empirical ego and the absolute ego, was thrown back exclusively on the use of reason in his effort to arrive at an absolute principle. Because his logic would not permit him to accept anything not discernible in or deducible from ordinary consciousness, Fichte asserted nothing of the absolute ego except mental activity. Thus, he refused even to attribute absolute existence to it. But the school of Shankara, trying to explain the ineffable experience of Brahman, declared that it is best, although imperfectly, described as absolute existence, absolute consciousness, and absolute bliss. Furthermore, Fichte saw no reason to regard nature as anything but thought, while Shankara stated that the world, although misinterpreted by us, is none other than Brahman. Profound differences between Fichte's and Shankara's ideas of God have their source in these divergent conceptions of the ultimate principle. Fichte identified God with the absolute ego, and maintained that the former, like the latter, lacks transcendental consciousness. No personal relationships are possible with his God, who, when contemporaneous with the universe, is without independent awareness, and exists only as man's highest aspiration. On the other hand, Shankara's lower Brahman, Ishvara, has transcendental consciousness and is completely independent of the universe, over which he rules. The individual may enter into a personal relationship with Ishvara, who may reasonably be expected to hear prayers addressed to him. In conclusion, it has become apparent in the course of the preceding analysis of Fichte's and Shankara's philosophies that they are not the virtually identical systems of thought which their real and apparent similarities have led some philosophers, particularly the very competent Rudolf Otto, to consider them to be. On the contrary, they contain basic divergences which owe their existence primarily to the fact that Fichte assumed the unconscious absolute ego to constitute a desirable but unattainable goal, while Shankara maintained that the absolute Brahman, which he described as consciousness itself, may be experienced as identical with the Atman in a state of transcendental awareness.